Good evening. My name is Carlos Eduardo Morreo. I'm an ANCLAS research associate and a graduate researcher here at the School of Politics and International Relations. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you and Dr. Raoni Rajão. I know this will be a great talk, and I know that because I've heard a slightly different version of it. It's great to see a couple of familiar faces and to hear what I know will be a really interesting piece. Raoni will be offering, he'll be presenting a case, this is my reading of his talk, he'll be presenting a case for local science and knowledge. He'll be making a plea for hybrid technoscience in Brazil and in Latin America. But he'll be doing this by means of a discussion about racial hybridity in Brazil. So it's a really interesting piece in that sense. But the truth is also that much of what he says about Brazil has, we can draw consequences, we can draw conclusions from it for other Latin American societies. But before I read out just a couple of kind of key elements from his CV, which is what you do on these occasions, I just wanted to stress something that I find particularly exciting and interesting about Raoni's research. He is really doing some cutting-edge work that is attempting to bring together research in environmental policy and environmental politics, sociology of science, or those of us who are kind of closer to that field called science and technology studies, postcolonial studies as well, and research into Latin America. So some of those key elements from the CV. Raoni is a senior lecturer in social studies of science and technology in the Department of Production Engineering, and a researcher with the Institute of Advanced Transdisciplinary Studies at the Federal University of Minas Gerais in Brazil, which is one of the top universities in Brazil. He also teaches at the in social and political sciences of the environment at Radboud University in the Netherlands. He's had a kind of a very interesting experience, a long experience working, together with United Nations agencies, and has done kind of consultancy work with senior officials from the state of Minas Gerais and at the federal government level in Brazil. He's published some exciting research in key disciplinary and interdisciplinary journals such as Global Environmental Politics, Theory, Culture and Society, and has edited a special issue of Science, Technology and Human Values, which is one of the key journals in the area of sociology of science. But he's also published work in one of the leading Global North scientific publications. So in a way, he's kind of crossing various bridges there. I've been fortunate to spend a couple of days with Raoni, listening to him, talking to him, discussing with him. He's here as an ANCLAS visiting fellow, but I also had the opportunity to spend a couple of days and talk with him in Melbourne, where he was a guest of the Institute of Postcolonial Studies. Raoni will speak for about 40 minutes. After that, we'll have a kind of an intimate Q&A for about 20 minutes. And then there'll be some wine and refreshments, the other important part of the evening. So please make Raoni welcome.
Thank you very much for all of you that have fought against the wind and the cold of Canberra and are here tonight. I'm very glad to see you. Tonight I'm going to be talking about the role of myths. And as you're going to see, it's myths understood not as only fiction, invention, but something more, something related to the history, related to how a people or a society relate to itself. From the perspective of postcolonial studies, which for those that are new to the field, it tries to understand how colonial relations, so North-South relations, relations of domination from certain countries, especially in Europe, is in relation to countries in the global south, developing countries, it continues through time. So the end of colonization doesn't mean that the power relations of the north in relation to the south have changed in the meantime. So in a sense, it tries to unravel how those power relations take place and how to change those power relations. A version of this article has been presented and published with a colleague of mine from the United States, Ricardo Duque, and it deals more specifically on the Journal of Science, Technology, and Human Values. So that what I'm going to present here is a variation of that. So these are two technologies which, for instance, have a place also in contemporary Brazil. One is a typical northern technology based on satellite imagery and geographic information systems, like the rural licensing of properties in Brazil, which has been actually having quite a significant prominence in the country. On the other hand, you have a technology also developed in Brazil, but not from, let's say, the very prominent laboratories of the National Institute of Space Research, but from a doctor, which have been working with very poor communities in the northeast of the country, and from leftovers of food has developed a mix, which is basically a way to improve the health of especially small children from very poor families. In relation to the first technology, when we take a closer look at how this technology has actually been deployed, the Cadastro Ambiental Rural, the environmental registry, even though the first version of this technology started being implemented in 1999 and is still to today, actually we have found out by looking at its effect that actually it increases deforestation rather than decrease deforestation for different reasons. Mostly because, for instance, in the case here, since it allows a more, let's say, it allows farmers to obtain quicker the allowance to deforest legally, and at the same time has not been successful in curbing deforestation, illegal deforestation taking place inside the system. It has been allowing basically a result which is against its aim. But nevertheless, it's still considered to be the mainstream policy in Brazil in terms of reducing deforestation. And for instance, the PPG7, which was this international experience funded by the G7 countries to reduce deforestation in the Amazon, is still regarded as the best result of the project. So you see this difficulty of actually acknowledging whether this has failed or not. On the other hand, this mixture has been widely adopted locally. Many organizations, NGOs, the church have been adopting it. The government at some point has also used it and allegedly has very strong effects, very positive effects in improving the health of kids. But then, more recently, the trade union and the group of researchers, and also with some links to major companies such as Nestlé, they have said that they have done some exams in this multimistura and told that there is no nutrients in this mixture. So the government has withdrawn support, and many other organizations, big organizations, have withdrawn report, even though local organizations still use it, and according to them, it makes a big difference in the life of those children. So the question here is, to what extent why it's so difficult to challenge the idea that northern technoscience, in this case, for instance, the satellite imagery, deterministically leads to certain good outcomes. You know, it has to work. It's modern. It comes from outer space, so it has to work. How it couldn't work, and which also on the other side, the other extreme, we have this idea. Well, if something comes from a local doctor dealing with poor people in the northeast of Brazil, yeah, let's better test it because it must be something wrong. And as long as you find something that doesn't quite go right, even though pragmatically many people say it works, the people from the ground are saying it works, then it's very quickly dismissed as just legend, as just something that's not quite working. Why is it so? Right. Why it's so difficult to challenge it? I mean, we have been publishing, doing evaluations of the environmental registry for quite some time, and the penny is not dropping, and people are not really taking it seriously. Well, one of the things that I'm trying to do in this paper here is to try to look historically at how certain types of science and technology have earned its key position in Brazil's imaginary. through the notion of myth, which I think is particularly interesting here because a myth by definition cannot be challenged just by showing the facts. You need something else. And that's what I'm going to be looking at in this specific case by looking at the history of Brazil. So myths are social imaginaries, imaginaries which are shared by a broader social groups, and by its nature are self-reaffirming narratives. So they are narrative with a beginning, with a middle, with an end, usually with a moral. And actually, this idea of myth, and especially of social imaginary in social science, is quite interesting because it tries to challenge the idea, which comes mostly from Marxist social theory, that the real conditions are the ones that determine how people see the world. So their conditions, their class position, and their material conditions are what determine what in this literature would be called its superstructure. But what some authors actually coming from also this Marxist tradition, so the neo-Marxist tradition, have been challenging is that actually it's when you see the world in certain ways, you interpret the world in certain ways, you act upon the world in that way, and it means that you change the world that way. So in the sense they have been revaluing the importance of ideas. And in particular, there is this quote from Padurai that imaginaries, they're not just, escape, something we dream of, but they are staging ground for action. When you live based on a myth, based on imaginary of what's possible, for instance, imagine two kids. One is grown up with this idea that he has a great potential, the world is his, through education he could raise through society, and the other one should just, his parents say, don't need to study, just get a good job because that's worthless. Of course, the imaginary that's put in the heads of the one kid is going to really change the way he sees the world, engage with the world, and I'm sure the first kid is going to have a better chance of having a better income than the second kid. And also, as part of this idea is this notion of memory work from Ashish Nandi that has been talking about how collective memories of society have a very important role in building the construction of the identity of the society. And this is not automatic. You need public intellectuals, you need historians, you need people that go there, collect data, build narratives, and tell these narratives to people. Which can be done quite informally. You can, for instance, imagine as a small group, a village, or even a family where people will tell, your parents or grandparents come from this city. They have, jumped out from a boat. And then actually made it himself as this wealthy man. And that one of the ideas that keep going in the family, or can be something more broadly, more based on the building of the nation state, which is what I'm particularly interested here. And since myths and as social imaginaries, they do not have a direct link to the perceived experience of people. They cannot be simply debunked when people go ahead and say, well, this is not true, this is actually inaccurate. They can only be reshaped and replaced by other myths. So there is this important process whereby a myth can only be countered by another myth. And what I'm particularly interested here are the so-called foundation myths of Brazil. The myths that tell us where does Brazil comes from, what is its social basis, what's its history. And which it's very important because when you tell a history about a people and about a nation, about its past, you're also bringing about the staging grounds for its future. So you're basically telling, because you have this specific kind of past, because, for instance, you are an immigrant country, or a country that comes from, for instance, the United States with the Mayflower, with the Puritans, and so on and so forth. Of course, the Puritanism is going to be an important value to bring forth, while if other people would say that instead, for instance, the United States is a country built out of immigrants, the immigration is going to be important for its future. So that's why the past and the future, they're strongly linked through those myths. And within that, I'm particularly interested in the myths that are related to North and South relations. So what in the myths tell us the origin of those ideas, the origins of those practices, and also what are the technoscientific elements of those myths. So what those myths tell us about how to manipulate our world, material world, through our practices and techniques and technologies and instruments, and ethnicity, so the races, the cultures that make up the country historically, and whether we have an understanding of technoscientific origin and ethnicity origin based on a purist understanding of that, so you have really to separate those two elements, or whether there is this notion of hybridism, that they are, what we are is actually based on the mixture of those different elements. And well, just as a way to organize the narrative, which is, I mean, it's a long time, it's lots of history, it's a very complicated history. I had to make some rather broad brushes in order to go through these periods. You pardon me for not, covering it all as it should have been, but I've organized the narrative of the foundation myths of Brazil in 3 phases: the monarchy, the republic, and the Estado Novo. However, I'm not talking here about the specific periods by themselves, so what has happened at each one of these periods, but how history and the foundation myths of Brazil were written by each one of those governments specifically. So I'm interested in the historiography of Brazil during those different regimes. So starting with the monarchy, and in particular with the imperial Brazil, the so-called imperial Brazil, that came about when Brazil was made independent from Portugal in 1822, which was, well, just to tell it very briefly, Brazil, Portugal as an empire had to move to Brazil during the Napoleonic Wars because otherwise it would have been conquered by Napoleon. And so for a while, the whole empire, a northern empire, was actually based in Brazil, which in itself a very interesting experience. Then when the situation changed in Europe, the court wanted to move back. There was lots of pressure from the state of Portugal and from the Portuguese, the wealthy Portuguese that stayed in Europe, for the court to move back. And that, of course, generated lots of tensions also in Brazil. So for a moment, there was the possibility that, for instance, Brazil would try to actually be completely independent and then monarchy, as pretty much the United States had done just before. And amidst that situation, the son of the King of Portugal, Dom Pedro I, took the decision to declare the independence of Brazil, creating some tensions also in relation to the Portuguese elite, but it was in a sense a sort of compromise. And but at that moment, though, Pedro I had a problem, right? Now there is Brazil. Brazil is a completely different country. They have to convince that also the Brazilians that they didn't need to get rid of the monarchy. So how can I now build the identity of Brazil? Make Brazil different from Portugal. Because that's exactly what Brazil didn't want to be again back then. He didn't want to be restated as a colony of Portugal. And so what you have here, it's a very interesting exercise, which actually also happened in Napoleonic France, where the state has explicitly tried to write a history and build a symbology of the country. In which, in the specific case of Brazil, there has been a national competition put forward by the recently created Institute of Geography and History of Brazil, called How to Write the History of Brazil. And different people had put forward ideas, and who has won this was actually a German. But it wasn't any German, was actually a German that immigrated to Brazil because, the royal family has married with Leopolda, which was actually from Austria, and then so you had this group of Austrians and Germans that moved to Brazil with that part of the court in order mostly to do research. And he actually traveled for many years in the countryside of Brazil, documenting its practices, its use, its music. Actually, there's some beautiful work that Martius and Spinks has written of traditional music that they have recorded. And so he was actually someone that was very knowledgeable of the history of Brazil and the peoples, the different peoples of Brazil. And so in this beautiful text, which is in a sense is still very important, he writes that when you write the history of Brazil, you have to take into account that we are witnessing the birth of a new people that's developing from the contact of very different races. And he's referring to the white, to the black, to the indigenous. With its peculiar physical and moral qualities, each race offers a special engine. So this idea that it's just because the black or the indigenous are different from the white doesn't mean they should be disqualified. They have its own contribution, its own way. Even though later on he would also say that the Portuguese, the white, are the one kind of leading it, but nevertheless, he's really recognizing the importance of the other races. The larger the number and the dignity of these races, the larger will be their influence in the common development of the country. So this idea that you really have to recognize that they play a key role. You cannot really forget about their history. And in this text, he actually gives some references and reinforces the importance of understanding and he was writing this during slavery in Brazil. So you have to imagine that it was, in a sense, quite a novelty. And interestingly, he gives some examples and say that the history of many peoples have shown that its importance to mix the races to obtain sublime ends in global order. So as mixing as something which is positive. Nobody can deny that the English owns its energy, steadiness, and perseverance to the mixture of the Celtic, the Danish, the Roman, the Anglo-Saxon, and the Normans. So he presents the English as a mixed race. Mm-hmm. And because of being mixed, they are strong. So it's interesting nowadays when we think about those relations, how they actually have changed. And we're going to see how they have changed. And also in art, I mean, this was the painting that decorated the back of the theater that was the court theater that was used for the coronation of Dom Pedro I as the king of Brazil. So it's very symbolic and very important. And as you can see, we have the monarchy, a constitutional monarchy at the top, actually modeled after England, and everybody's praising, helping the monarchy. And they are doing this by giving what they can offer. So for instance, you have the whites, Portuguese with the cannon, with the modern European technology, but likewise you have the indigenous with the bow and arrows. I mean, it's important to have their contribution too. And in the same way you have the blacks willingly giving their labor, their lives also for the country. You have, this is all set in a tropical beach. You have tropical fruits here, and you have this lady that has 2 white children and one mixed children in her bag, showing that the children, the future of the country, and the future of the country is coming from this mixture. Well, it's difficult to relate how those ideas were put in practice, but it's certain that at least it offered, let's say, a historical antecedent, which is interesting to have in mind, especially when we consider the changes, the political and mythological changes that took place during the Republic period in Brazil. And here we have a specific figure which is very important, which is the figure of the Bandeirante, which is the conquistador, the Portuguese white conquistador, allegedly, that goes from the coastline to the inland in order to civilize the country. And here we have 3 figures which are particularly important as building this mythology. One, which has been quite influential to many Brazilian writers, which is Arthur de Gobineau, which is also one of the key figures of eugenics, of ideas of racial and geographic determinism, which actually has been to Rio de Janeiro. And he was horrified. He said that was the worst place ever, and thanks to the mix of the different races. And he used the example of Rio de Janeiro to make the point that how awful that could be. Actually, he also used the example of the United States, which then when they translate to English, from French to English, they just forget to translate those parts, because of course they were trying to put forward a specific narrative of themselves. But nevertheless, he also complains about that. Oliveira Viana, which was linked to a group of intellectuals also in Rio de Janeiro that wrote the first account of the peoples of Brazil, and Monteiro Lobato, which was a writer, a political activist, especially from the right wing, and which also has put forward some interesting characters and histories and stories that are important for us. So this is the Bandeirante, right? So this tall figure, usually depicted this way, this is actually was painted specifically for the Museu Paulista, the Paulista Museum, which was thought to be as this shire for the birth of the country, built in São Paulo, which was at that moment the richest city in Brazil, which wanted to reaffirm itself as the leading part of the country. And it was important for them to also establish this through the Bandeirantes, because In contrast to Minas Gerais, with the goat and the art, they didn't have that kind of lineage. And also, the court was first in Salvador and then in Rio de Janeiro, so it didn't have that kind of past. So it needed to kind of put forward this idea that São Paulo somehow, and the Bandeirantes, many of them left from São Paulo, were this engine of the country. And this is a passage from a quote from Oliveira Viana, from Populações Meridionais do Brasil, where he describes the role and the importance of these Bandeirantes. So the superior function of the Bandeirante is the responsibility of the pure Aryans. It's important here because the Gobineau was the first to establish this idea of the racial superiority of the Aryans, mostly because he wanted to justify why the aristocrats should be dominating the rest, right? And his idea was because the aristocrats are mostly blonde, Germanish, even those, for instance, live in Italy, they are more intelligent, they are fit to rule. So that's basically one of the ideas came from, and why Aryanism, which was then translated into Nazism, came from. And he's also in Toné, and which was linked to Oliveira Viana. Toné was one of the directors of the Museu Paulista, where this painting was made. Was also writing that the Bandeirantes were actually not only Portuguese, but were the descendants of the Aryan Portuguese. So like the best of the Portuguese, not those, kind of brownish Portuguese. So there was also these internal distinctions they wanted to make. So it is the responsibility of pure Aryans with the help of superior mestizos that have already been Aryanized. So there is this idea that was starting to emerge also among doctors in Brazil that it was possible to Aryanize, to somehow mix the mestizos, to make them whiter, to make them smarter, and make them assistants to this noble race of Aryans that were the Bandeirantes and, of course, the elite of the country. These are those that, by owning the instruments of discipline and education, so it's epistemological as well, right? It's about knowledge, dominate this populous, deformed mass of inferior mestizos. And by keeping them through juridical and social control within the norms of the Aryan norm, we'll be able to slowly improve them towards the mentality of the white race. And we have to understand, these are very strong words, but this was in a period that Brazil was seeing the rapid rise of the United States, and it started to ask itself, why us and not them? Why are we kind of poor, and the United States is becoming this empire? And one of the answers he found was, well, because the United States is whiter than us, because they are purer than us. So let's try to drive ourselves towards also that situation. So there was really this idea of white supremacy, but as a way of social engineering and development. These ideas were very much linked here. And this was also strongly related to knowledge and to science. So, and this is particularly clear in the story of Jeca Tatu, from Monteiro Lobato, which actually first in the 1914 version, Jeca Tatu was stupid because it was a mestizo and there was nothing that could be done. But then he rewrote this story 10 years later, saying that actually if you give him the right medicine, if you treat him, if you teach him how to be a good citizen, an entrepreneur, you can actually make him, someone which is successful, someone that is just like the superior mestizos that Oliveira Viana was talking about. So, for instance, here we have Jeca Tatu, which is this countryside, a farmer, which is ill, which is very poor, and the doctor comes and identifies, look here, this is the problem, you have a disease. The doctor treats the disease, and after that you see him much stronger, working, in a very Protestant way, with the Protestant spirit really taking him over, and he's earning money. Then he's able now to increase his plantation, and finally he becomes a wealthy farmer owning a tea fort, of course imported from the United States, but that's another matter. So you see here how knowledge and technology from the North are the ones really solving the problems of the South and leading the way of the South. And this was very much transformed into policy. This is actually my school, that's where I'm from, the School of Engineering from the Federal University of Minas Gerais that was built in 1911 as part of the construction of this new capital, of course, like Canberra and like Brasilia, based, of course, on new rational basis. And this is Oswaldo Cruz, which had played a key role not only in bringing and actually also being an active researcher in epidemiology, but also implementing sanitizing activities in Rio de Janeiro, so quite often against the will of the population, up to extent there has been the revolt of the vaccines. People have been forced by gunmen to be vaccinated, and then they revolted against, they destroyed cars, they destroyed, lighting poles. So actually there was a revolt against technology, northern technology specifically. So that's why you see him with cannons killing, all the peace in a very militarized way. And also in terms of not only the technological side, but also in the ethnical side, we have a specific whitening policy of the population. Brazil has put in place policies that have brought millions of Germans, Italian, Polish to live in Brazil as a way to somehow make the inferior mestizos into superior mestizos. And what you see here is basically a call to Italy, calling the emigranti italiani to read this document prima di partire alla provincia di São Paulo. So before going to São Paulo to start a new life, and they would read this and get to know what are the rights, what are the possibilities, and be interested in to migrate to Brazil. And also as very much made explicit in art. This is a painting from Modesto Broco called The Redemption of Can. Can is a grandson of Noah that has been punished because his dad saw Noah naked and made fun of him. And Noah said, well, I blame you and I curse you to be enslaved. And so the descendants of Can are the slaves. And it's said, then it becomes dogma, it's not in the Bible that they have become dogma, that Can was, from all the offspring from Noah, the one that had a darker skin. So this has become, the history of Can has become a theological justification for slavery. And what we see here is the redemption of that, the redemption of Can. So you see a very black old lady whose daughter just have given birth to her grandchildren, that thanks to the process of miscegenation and the proud, probably Italian immigrant here, is a white lady. So, it's solved, and she's thanking God that now, she has basically cleaned the lines of her family. Then you have an interesting process that happens, this time not through explicit request from the government, but from the action of public intellectuals, artists, poets at different levels. What we have in the beginning of the century is somehow a preoccupation and an uneasiness of different artists at different levels with somehow the mismatch between the official image of the country and what themselves saw as being Brazil. So there has been this soul-searching exercise towards the Brazilian identity, which has been actually called the modernist movement in arts, or the essayists, which is this group of writers, historians, sociologists, anthropologists. And here they really tried an active way to create a new foundation myth. So for instance, this is a painting from Tarsila do Amaral from the 30s, which was one of the first paintings that showed that you had white people, you had mestizo people, you had black people, you had Japanese people that now immigrating to Brazil by millions. And this is Brazil. Let's face Brazil. These are the workers, with the chimneys that are now populating São Paulo. Let's face it. And let's be proud of it. So she was painting it and putting this into a museum. There is the important manifesto written by Andrade, where he basically calls for the importance of Brazil of he calls cannibalism in a symbolic way, that Brazil is made of its ability to eat up other culture, other races, and digest it and make it something new. So this idea of transformation through assimilation, and then he asks in the end, whether should we do this? The Tupi are an indigenous group that were known to be cannibals, and so he asked, Tupi or not Tupi? Also making a parallel with English, in a sense, are we going to want to be Americanized, a new European, and then kind of fail? Or should we kind of accept, we are Tupi, we are cannibals, let's accept it. And two characters, especially when you look at the historiography of Brazil, have been particularly important. One of them was Gilberto Freire, which was an anthropologist, and the other one is Sérgio Buarque de Holanda, a historian. And what these authors have been writing and kind of challenging is the traditional binary classification of race that usually we have in Europe, that white is everything that is not white. So I mean, as long as we have the first drop, the first drop rule, then it suddenly changes and becomes something else. The others, the limit between us and the others is very subtle. And since what we are building, since the relations are built around the notion of purity, the process of transformation into the other, it happens very quickly with very small intervention. And what these writings have been showing, it's something which actually kind of exists also in contemporary Brazil, is that actually classifications are much more fluid. You know, the notion of white and whiteness depends on the context, depends on the clothing, depending on the class. There is this very, very wide category of moreno, moreninho, which kind of takes almost, basically, most of the population, where black tends to be very restricted, nowadays increasing a bit because people are coming to realize the importance and being proud for having African heritage. But just to say that it's something which is overlapping, something that's complex, something that is very contextual. And we think that, especially in the writing of Gilberto Freire and others, you have, for the first time again, since the monarchy, the idea that purism is actually a problem. It's a vice rather than a virtue. So, for instance, this is a passage in the work of Gilberto Freire where he's talking about the Dutch, where the Dutch is a particularly counterpoint in the history of Brazil, because the Dutch have owned a part of the northeast of Brazil for some time. They were the ones actually bringing to Brazil the first university, the parliament. The first parliament in Global South was in Brazil. And so they were really trying to build a new Amsterdam, a new Netherlands, a tropical Netherlands in Brazil. And from time to time, you see discussions, even between friends, oh, what if the Dutch had won and instead of the Portuguese, Brazil would have been much wealthier, Brazil would have been just as the United States, and blah, blah, blah. And here, Freire is actually making the counterpoint, and as others have done, and Holanda also makes the same point, that the Dutch have imposed the European structure to the tropical city, this in Recife, in the northeast of Brazil, without any adaptation. It's still possible to see nowadays in the old houses of Recife, and I was able to find a drawing of the time, as you can see the rooftops. The roof that seemed to be waiting till the snow to fall, as you know, because they just took that's the architecture, just put it there. Without the plasticity of the Portuguese, without their unique and marvelous ways of transgressing, adapting and creating new and special ways of life, the Dutch lived in Brazil a very artificial life. Some Dutchmen had to, for some Dutchmen, everything had to be in Brazil as in their motherland. The house, the food, the woman, no exoticism. So they basically brought, actually, Recife had one of the biggest brothels in the Global South at the time, especially because of those needs of the Dutchmen, which were very, actually living only in cities. They had difficulty going to the countryside, and actually they depended on the Portuguese for the economic activity of the region, and that's what actually was one of the reasons why they had failed. So, I mean, it was exactly for the lack of the capacity of the Dutch to adapt that they have came out of Brazil. So, in a sense, having the Dutchmen to build Brazil would have been an impossibility. I mean, that's what they are trying to argue here because of their purity. And also, we think that they do a specific charge against the notion of the Bandeirantes as depicted by previous historians of the Republic. So, what we hear here, for instance, is Buarque de Holanda that finds a letter written by the Bishop of Olinda that just came from Portugal and happened to meet the Bandeirante José Domingos Velho, which is this big guy here that we just saw. Opa. This one here. Just keep his image in the mind. And by saying that man is living in the jungle. He neither knows Portuguese nor how to talk the language, nor is different from the most barbarian Tapuya, the indigenous guy, even if he claims he's a Christian. So, I mean, he's talking, oh, this guy doesn't even knows Portuguese, he's mixed. And actually, he would probably be much more similar to this painting from Elkhart that one of the artists brought by the Dutch to Brazil, with, with some technologies, with mixed blood, rather than being this almost king-like, nobleman, this Aryan that has been depicted originally by Tonet and other, Oliveira and the others. And we think that they have been emphasizing that, which is kind of depicted in that racial classification, how Brazil is hybrid in its past as is in its future. So, for instance, Gilberto Freire is saying here in The Masters and Slaves, this classical piece, that every Brazilian, even the light-skinned, fair-haired ones, carry about him on his soul, when not on the soul and the body alike, the shadow or at least the birthmark of the indigenous or the Negro. In our affections, in our excessive mimicry, you probably noticed that, our Catholicism, which so delights the senses, our music, our gait, our happiness, our speech, our cradle songs, in everything there is a sincere expression of our lives. We almost all of us bear the mark of that influence. So that idea that, I can be blonde, I can be in the south of Brazil, I can be Japanese, which is quite common in Brazil, but I know how to dance samba, I know how to move. And these are elements, these cultural elements that come directly from the indigenous and from the black are a key aspect of what we are. And also they have highlighted how the colonial enterprise has been strongly based on mixed technologies. Starting from communication, for instance, the Portuguese didn't arrive in Brazil and try to make people learn Portuguese to start commerce, to start colonization, but instead learned the indigenous language, which was actually very widespread. Until the mid to the end of the 19th century, the most well-spoken language in Brazil was Tupi. It wasn't Portuguese. And also the local diet. They didn't bring cereals and from Portugal or olive oil. They were basically eating, hunting, manioc, all the local produces. Also personal hygiene, in terms of taking baths, of having that kind of behavior, cleaning hands, housing, transportation, and also the very process of miscegenation. So, there was these are technologies / techniques which have been, according to these authors, without which Brazil would not have actually, that small country called Portugal, with just a few million people, would not have been able to somehow spread its influence and build a state as big as Brazil. And Getúlio Vargas was a very smart guy, the president that actually a coup d'etat took power in the 30s, and then was elected, and then did another coup d'etat. So it's a very complicated story, but to cut it short, even though he was from the south, so not necessarily, let's say, the most mixed part of the country, and also even though he was a fascist, to a large degree, he had some relatively close relations to Mussolini, and did not dislike necessarily Hitler, even though, because of different circumstances, ended up siding with the United States. He saw that it was important to have a culture, to have a mythology of the country, which was not dissimilar from the face of the people in the streets. He was a populist. He knew the importance of drawing upon that. So he explicitly tried to recreate as an official image of the country, as a government image of the country, this idea, this celebration of hybridism. And that's why, for instance, he was actually the first one to officially sponsor samba. He created the carnival, the official carnival we know about. He was giving money to these people. He was paying for the creation of music, like Aquarela do Brasil, the famous one, Aquarela, it's like watercolors of Brazil, this idea of mixture, which one of the verses say that we have to take out the black mother from the outbacks, from the Cerrado. So let's not forget it's there. Let's bring it forth. Let's not be ashamed of our African roots as well. And she, for instance, was the one that actually sponsored Carmen Miranda, that was a raising artist at the time of the rhythm of samba, which was actually quite different from the music which was mostly Modinha, the styles which didn't have that strong influence of rhythms, of African rhythms. And she, for instance, and Vargas paid her ticket to go to the United States, to Broadway, to Hollywood, to basically be the face of Brazil, even though she was Portuguese, but that's not the matter. But and the way she moved, the way she sung, and the music was certainly central parts to that process. However, if let's say the ethnic part, the racial and cultural part of the Estado Novo was strongly grounded in this idea of miscegenation, the same cannot be said in relation to technology. Also because we have to think that during the interwar period and after the war, when internationalism and when the United States put forward the idea that it should help to bring development. So the Point 4 program from Truman, where Truman was basically saying, oh, we don't have the means, the money, basically to improve the world, even though he was giving quite a lot of money to Europe at the time, he chose not to give similar amounts of money to the global south. He said, well, we have knowledge, we have technology, we can give knowledge as much as we want. And if you have our knowledge, our scientific knowledge, then you can become like us. So there was this idea of basically donating knowledge, technology transfer, which actually then it's another matter, as a means for development. And Getúlio Vargas was a strong supporter of that. He did strong programs of modernization, of building heavy industry, and that's why, for instance, this is the image which is in the note of Ten Reis, which, by the way, Brazil back then was known as Estados Unidos do Brasil, United States of Brazil. So you see, that's not for a reason. And the symbol of national unity is a white guy with some laurels. So this idea of Greek knowledge, classical knowledge, holding a scepter, which is a piston, a mechanical piston of a big engine, an industrial engine, in his hand as if it was the thing that would bring him power. With some telephone wires and telegraph wires in his feet for the communication, pretty much like Hermes. So it was, being doing the communication between the gods and humankind. Some clogs in the back, and here in the background you see some big industries, chimneys pumping out lots of pollution. But back then was a dream of Brazil. There was this idea, if Brazil had just those big chimneys, maybe it would be a richer place or a more developed place. And so what we have here is this process whereby in the monarchy, the myth that dominated the sociality in Brazil, the social measurement in Brazil, was based on both a hybrid ethnic and technoscientific dimension. Then during the Republic period, that changed dramatically as there was an emphasis on purism on both sides, which then changed again, but where some public intellectuals going against all the odds. We have to imagine when Gilberto Freire and Hollanda and others were writing about the importance of miscegenation, we saw the rise of Nazi Germany. We saw the rise of eugenics throughout the world. Eugenics were being taught in the United States, in Harvard, in Cambridge, in Oxford. That was the official scientific knowledge about the relation between races and human development. And these people were saying, look, no, miscegenation is beautiful. This is such an act, such a revolutionary act at the time. And that was taken up by the Brazilian government, even though it was a fascist government. So you can see, how far this group of public intellectuals have been, and also changing this north-south relation where Brazil is usually just buying out ideas that come from other countries. However, when it comes to the technoscientific dimension, then again, we are stuck in the idea of purity, the idea that we need to copy and paste what has been developed elsewhere, especially in the global north, in order to achieve development. So it leaves us some provocations here. And the first of all is, well, if the ethnical became hybrid in Brazil against the odds, why not the technoscientific? Why not can we challenge this idea that science and technology is developed in a very specific way from very specific sources? Why not, for instance, show that, as a matter of fact, most of modern medicine today that comes from the discovery of new elements from nature are based on prior knowledge. I mean, scientists, and I had some experience also at my university and other universities, don't go around just taking plants and see what happens. They go to the people, talk to people, interview indigenous populations. They pre-select and say, well, is it for a headache? Is it for an anesthesia? Well, actually, we use these for that purpose. And they would then do bioprospecting on that. That would become a scientific paper, would be registered in a laboratory in Switzerland, and then Brazil would buy it. So, and then of course, all that knowledge that was being at the basis of that was just being erased, as if it never happened. And so, how can we deal with it? And the problem is we can't just go there and debunk those myths. Just say, oh, see, it's a lie. They're really trying to deceive you. But we have to make myths. We have to be myth makers, as Buarque de Holanda, as Gilberto Freire, as those public intellectuals in Brazil. So we need to put forward, as intellectuals, as scholars, narratives of successful hybridisms, of cases where those things have happened, they have had positive effects in society. And of course, that's not an easy process. I mean, there are risks in translation. There are risks when you put ideas forward. And for instance, in the case of Brazil, the very myth of racial democracy, this idea that, everybody's the same because there is mixture is beautiful, has prevented Brazil to discuss racism, which exists. But then, oh, no one is racist. No, I'm not racist. So there is kind of this double-edged sword, but then what should we do? Become irrelevant? Just sit down and complain about the state of the world? Or should we try to do something about that? And on that note, I thank you very much. Yeah, but an interesting thing of what I said, though, which links directly to the notion of myths, so that's why when I read history here, I'm reading historiography, and I'm reading history as the expression of self-identity of Brazil in a given moment by a given group of intellectuals. I'm not trying to find a factual history. Right. And interestingly, for instance, the very reconceptualization of Domingos o Velho was an accomplishment of writers such as Sérgio Buarque de Holanda, Gilberto Freire, and so on, especially Buarque de Holanda, who in Raízes do Brasil brings that forth. If you read what was the official, historiography of the Republic, the way they described it, by people that they were the directors of Museu Paulista, these were the people basically telling the people what they are, right? And basically they were saying was, one, the monarchy was a relic of colonial Brazil. It was about the past. It was a weight. You have to share that weight and try to be an European country, pretty much like the United States. And of course, when you do this, you bring out lots of injustice. One thing which I think have happened was this recovery of many of the themes brought forward by the monarchy, but not necessarily the monarchy itself. Even though there has been some contemporary readings of Gilberto Freire and some attacks on Gilberto Freire for how he revalued the family, tradition, and so on and so forth. For instance, there is this new book that has been said, Freire spent a long time also in the West, but then also had links with England. He kind of felt like an Englishman, like a nobleman. That's why he writes as he writes, which I think is, again, really, not a very subtle way. There are better ways of putting this. But nevertheless, this idea that the Portuguese were the cause of Brazil's underdevelopment, and especially the monarchy and the colony, that's something which is still very strong in Brazil. So you see some elements coming through, but others really remaining very strongly under the spell of the Republican narrative. In the two dimensions I'm interested in, you have on the technological side, you have the technoscientific side, you still have a strong influence of this idea of purity, of this idea that technology has certain standards, and those standards are not created by Brazil, is not imposed, but instead are imposed from abroad. And this can actually spread in all directions. I kind of play by the system because it's almost contradictory, the fact that I can't write in Portuguese. I can't, because if I do write in Portuguese, they are not published in international journals with high impact factor, and so on and so forth. So for instance, what I'm doing personally, I first publish that international journal, get all my points, get my, my international mobility, etc., and then I translate the book chapter in Portuguese. So So just to tell you one aspect of that, and because of also this idea that certain technologies which come from certain places have some special powers, there has been an interesting new book that has been published about science technology in Brazil called Beyond Imported Magic, because this idea that you just get, well, it's not a direct critique, but I mean, Brazil actually just today inaugurated the new supercomputer. And the minister of the minister have said, well, Brazil is very proud because of this is going to be a jump in science and it's going to help our self-esteem. I mean, so you can see how that's linked to that. On the other hand, I think it's still quite strong in Brazil, even though it has been challenged over the years for different reasons. The notion of racial democracy. And it has been challenged for some good reasons and also for some bad reasons. I mean, some of the bad reasons, I think, was actually there is an article from Pierre Bourdieu, the sociologist, which is called The Cunning of Imperialism. And it was basically saying how science, even social theory was being imposed from the north to the south and cunningly changed the way the South sees itself. And he talks about racial theory. Basically, it's like that figure, right? One of the examples he gives is that, well, in the United States, we have, one drop makes you black. I mean, Obama's mother is white. And in Brazil, he might be called Moreno or whatever, but in the United States, he's black. There is no question he's kind of mixed. He's black because, he has some black blood. And while in Brazil, things are much more complicated and much more interesting as well, and are much more mobile. And because they are more mobile, I think there is more room for maneuver, more room for discussion, rather than just putting in a specific box. And he basically, Bourdieu in that article kind of criticized that and blames the Brazilian social scientists that go to the United States, do their PhD there, look at those racial theories and just import those racial theories into Brazil, which then, for instance, get placed into policies such as the quotas at universities, which are necessary on the one hand because statistically, and that's very much true, the darker you are, the poorer you are. And universities and public universities paid with taxpayer money is a way out of poverty. So let's kind of use that as a channel. But on the other hand, it creates two problems. One, it doesn't solve the basic problem, which is to improve free public education, because then you just create a channel up there. And second, it created a problem that Brazilians didn't have before. Now, Brazilians have to fill a form where it's written black and white, and they just look at that, what am I? Do I do this? Do I do that? And then you have crazy stories like this pair of twins that lived in different cities, and one twin used to take more sun than the other twin, and one of the twins were able to get into the quotas as black, and the other one was not able to get into the quotas because he was not black enough according to the criteria of the same university. So, you reintroduce problems which were played out at different levels. So it's something which is evolving, but nevertheless, I think they were able to do something interesting. This is public intellectuals that I'm talking about. Brazil is currently through a very complicated period. I mean, it takes a few bottles of wine to kind of go through the whole. I mean, it's true. It was criticized, and I think for good reason, because Brazil has been coming through a process of trying to bring up representation, also racial and gender representation in government, and I don't think he was very careful when he first chose. Then he selected as like at second level, not at ministry level, but as secretary level, some women, some minorities. I mean, this is a term that's not quite applied in Brazil, but people which are not white. So, but it's it's more conservative, the government. According to the latest historiography which is brought during this final period, when they describe what were the official policies during the monarchy and also the colonial period, actually it's the other way around. I mean, even though it was also full of contradictions. For instance, there were rulings against mixing the Portuguese with the Africans, with the blacks, even though slaves being able to earn money and by their own freedom, or getting married with the bosses, or as a way of, or even becoming quite wealthy, were relatively common. I mean, if you go throughout the historical cities of Brazil, you see beautiful, huge churches built by the slaves for the slaves, for the blacks for the blacks. I mean, you don't. If you go to Louisiana, you don't see that. If you go to the United States, you don't see that. Which shows basically how independent they were and how much of economic force they were. So there were some of those things going on, but then there was much more room. In relation to the indigenous, actually there was quite a lot of incentives for miscegenation, actually. Even official incentives for the miscegenation. For instance, one of, even at the very first phase of colonization, again, that's the account of the last historiographers, there was, in the city of Salvador, they were basically bringing, first the Portuguese arrived, and they were bringing the women that were not able to marry because they were orphans, were poor, or maybe they were too ugly for different reasons, to get married in Brazil, right? And at some point there is a letter from clergy from Brazil writing to Portugal saying, no, you don't need to send us a woman anymore, right? We are fine, you know, the indigenous women here are getting married well, they are happy, the Portuguese are happy, everybody is happy. So, and even there has been legislation against discrimination of the indigenous, because one of the explanations for that is that the cosmology of the Portuguese, which was a cosmology based on the warrior, the explorer, with power, physical power, was somehow similar to what they were observing with the indigenous. The indigenous were great warriors, they were great hunters and explorers. So the Portuguese kind of felt that they had some noble traces which kind of reflected them, and so that's why there has been quite a bit of miscegenation also officially so. One of the consequences of that and one of the problems of that is culturally today, the influence of which has origins in indigenous, I mean, in cultural terms, etc., are much subtler than the ones from African origin. So I mean, it's really dissipated. I personally, I have indigenous blood. That my grandmother from my mother's side, but then I don't know the name of the tribe, I don't know the language, I don't know the mythology. You know, because that's not something that has been carried out as strongly, for instance, as the rhythms from Africa, the food from Africa, the religions from Africa. So you see that coming much stronger today. So they have this contradiction. Well, I think there are some interesting developments nowadays, and even, for instance, in terms of management of forests and how on products from the so-called non-timber forest products. Biomedicine, it's a great example. But I mean, the problem is those are still have to be discovered and put forward, because one of the problems we have is as there is this great paper whose title says everything, that you have science for the West and myth for the rest. So this idea that, you know, we are the ones producing knowledge. You know, there are no official knowledges. The knowledge from other sources, they are not really to be counted. And the point here is not to replace one thing to the other, because that would basically bring us to another form of purism, which is wrong. But instead to try to first officially recognize when that kind of communication happens, and as in a sense I'm trying to do here. You know, I'm basically looking at Brazilian intellectuals and see how innovative they were. You know, how forward they were against all the odds, against all the international influence at that time. And so in my little here, I'm also trying to build a myth that a group of intellectuals in Brazil are able to, this kind of David are able to go into this racist Goliath that was going on in the beginning of the 20th century. And if that was possible, why not to do this into the future, and why not to find other cases which can bring us similar examples?
Against the Goliath of northern science.
Exactly.
Well, and thank you very much. Let's thank